so many markets across the country are having these issues, there's going to be some sort of major issue at some point where people start actually getting sick or tragically even dying. And I think that's the point where people will start paying attention. And it's sad that it has to get to that point. Yeah. But that's the path we're heading down if we don't correct this situation.
Well, I've spent over 25 years building multi-million-dollar companies and landing massive exits. If you're on your journey to big success, you have to learn from people who have done it. And that's exactly why you're here. So if you're ready to level up, hit subscribe and never miss a beat. Today, I'm sitting down with Eric Casey, managing editor of the Worcester Business Journal. He started in the cannabis industry before jumping into journalism, and now he's breaking stories that shape Worcester and Central Massachusetts.
How I made the jump into journalism from the cannabis space is I really saw a need for more writing about it. And as I started to get that process underway, I realized that I couldn't really work in the industry and write about it and still write about it from the perspective that I wanted to write it.
From the drama at the Cannabis Control Commission to the shifts fueling the local economy.
One of the things we found was that one of their own science-focused staff members was having trouble accessing testing data from the actual commission, kept asking for the testing data from the commission, couldn't get it, and then went to a public presentation at a conference and saw somebody presenting the data that they had access to a public records request.
Worcester is a city in evolution, built on grit and hustle, but also grappling with gentrification and the growing pains that come with rapid change.
I think it's still a pretty strong market. You just have a lot of people living there who are struggling with cost of living, which is sadly something that's not unique to Worcester at this point in the country.
In this episode, we'll dive into its future, spot emerging trends, and explore how Eric uncovers the headlines that really matter.
Yeah, so I'm Eric Casey. I'm a managing editor at the Worcester Business Journal, and I'm a journalist who has been covering the cannabis industry for about 4 or 5 years now. And previous to that, I worked in the industry for about 4 or 5 years.
Okay, so you've been at it for a while. So that's like 8 to 10 years.
Yeah, I first joined the industry as an intern, Stone College in 2014. So
Stoned College?
Still in college.
Oh, I think you said you went to something called Stoned College. I was like, I never heard of that one. That was a good one.
But yeah.
I went to Stoner College.
Basically. Yeah, it wasn't officially called that.
And so yeah, actually, before we kick off even the origin story portion of this one, maybe we should start with a disclaimer that, like, you got approval to be on the pod.
Yes.
Because, there's a lot, you're a journalist, and so there's approval process for a lot of things editorially. And maybe could we disclaim that, like, maybe some of the things you say on here aren't necessarily representative of your like,
absolutely.
Business Journal?
Yes. Yeah, that's fair to say.
Maybe because I might be asking a question, you might be like, oh, you know what? Personally, this is what I believe, but maybe it doesn't reflect necessarily WBJ.
Yeah. I'll make it clear when I'm wearing my journalism hat.
Okay, guys. So take me through that origin story just a little bit. Like, we don't have to go too deep into it. Basically, I didn't realize you had been in the industry before being a journalist.
Yes, absolutely.
Wait a second. Did you go to journalism school while you're in the cannabis industry?
No, so actually not technically, didn't go to school for journalism. I started, let's back up to the beginning of college. So I actually went to the University of Rhode Island. I was originally supposed to be going to their journalism school. Before I even actually set foot on campus to actually start there, I kind of been talked out of it, basically. A lot of people at the time were like, journalism's dying. Yeah. Even when I went to, the kind of whatever they call that, orientation or whatever, before you actually, are on campus full time, I went to the meeting for the journalism school, and they were like, get a second major. So even the people that were teaching,
So you're going there and you're literally paying them money to teach you journalism. And they were like,
first thing,
go find a second job.
Yeah, find a second major, which I think is solid advice for any journalists, not to have some sort of life experience outside of just doing journalism, some sort of understanding. Like, if you're going to be a business journalist, studying economics and journalism makes a lot of sense. So that is good advice. But, I was kind of taken aback by how pretty much every adult figure in my life was at that point was like, don't do journalism.
That's amazing. Yeah. And you're making quite a go at it right now too, which is in spite of all the facts. So actually we were just talking about Worcester Patch. So how does that model even work? Because since journalism not is dead, but has been on a steady decline, you get these things like patches showing up, right? And it's a representative of like a few towns together sometimes, or it's just like, because I think we have a patch, but it's like Medway Millis together or something like that.
Right. So I guess the Patch Network is something that's across the country at this point. It's trying to provide journalism into local communities. So they kind of have a number of websites, and sometimes the content is changed, interchangeable between some of them. You'll see something that was posted in Worcester Patch also end up in another patch nearby. So it's just kind of this model is trying to fill that need for local journalism. And there's a lot of different models people are experimenting with in journalism, Substacks, nonprofit models. Everybody's trying to figure out how to survive in this landscape because, the traditional, physical newspaper with a bunch of ads in it that, cover the cost of producing the newspaper, that business model is not what it used to be. Although the Worcester Business Journal, it still does a print edition every other week. So
every other week.
Yeah.
Wow. So because I know that I think once a month in the mail, I get my Medway Millis patch.
Right. Okay.
And it is, a lot of ads inside there. And I've even thought about 21 plus, 85%, 21 plus. Can I add, can I put an ad into this thing? And I haven't actually explored any of that stuff, but I do know that there's, we get it once a month, and it's interesting to have a print version because I actually do flip through every page because it doesn't happen that often. I get them that I'm like, oh, let me just see this. And sometimes I'll see somebody I know in it. Right. So that's the local aspect. Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So my brother-in-law would be, when he was the varsity basketball coach, for instance, he was like, hey, they just hired a new varsity basketball coach. And I was like, oh my God, there's Eric, right?
Yeah.
And so it's actually fun to see these things. Even my kids have been in a few times and stuff like that. So I do like that local feel.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that the advertising model, it's really, and it has a ton of ads in it, of course, to be able to support that model. But you were saying that there's only an editor and a journalist per patch or something?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure. I've never worked there or anything like that. But it's very bare bones, model. And that's not rare in journalism these days is that, newsrooms aren't as big as they used to be. At the Business Journal, it's me and two other people in our editorial newsroom. Pretty much everywhere across the country, newsrooms are a lot smaller, which means journalists have to do a lot more and cover a lot more, which unfortunately means, news does fall through the cracks more than it used to just because there aren't as many journalists out there.
And so what is your coverage area?
Yeah, so my coverage area is all of Worcester County and then the western half of Middlesex County. So it's actually an area that's bigger than the state of Rhode Island is the area I'm responsible for. So
and how many people are on your team?
It's me and two other, full-time people on the editorial staff.
So 3 full-timers.
Yes, and then we have some freelancers that help, especially with some of the longer feature articles for our division. So
yeah, and so what, now that how long have you been at the Worcester Business Journal?
So I've been there about 14 months now.
Okay.
So, yeah.
And has anything changed? Have you gone, because there's actually for the people who are listening for the first time and maybe don't understand how journalism works, you still have an editor above you,
yes,
right?
Yes.
So you write the story or someone else or freelancer writes the story, you edit it and whatever, and then maybe even gets passed up to somebody else to double check facts and figures and stuff like that, right?
Right.
So with the limited amount of resources that a newsroom has, you still have to follow a specific journalism process.
Right.
Because journalism is a specific discipline. It's like a scientist. It's like there's certain things you have to follow the scientific method, right? Or whatever it might be, like to do real science versus and also real journalism.
Uh-huh.
How do you feel like about, because again, the disclaimer's out of the way.
Yes.
There are a bunch of, pseudo journalists in the Massachusetts cannabis industry also, and whether or not they're considered true journalists or not, I don't even know if there's a distinction. Maybe they are true journalists based on the truth of kind of they're trying to do. But you also had a stint like that as well because you were on Substack.
Yes, I was on Substack. Yeah. With Burn After Reading, my newsletter on Substack. Yep.
Yeah, and so Burn After Reading was covering mostly the cannabis industry?
Yeah, I was covering the cannabis industry really globally. It was kind of from my particular focus, so I was here in Massachusetts, so there's definitely a lot of Massachusetts content, but anything that caught my attention in cannabis, whether it was here or in Thailand or Jamaica or Canada or wherever.
Oh yeah, Thailand was coming out with cookies and stuff like that. I remember those days. Yeah, so what Burn After Reading, it was just, where did that come from, that name?
So that name, I was just brainstorming, actually. Funny enough, it was actually, to go back a little bit, how I made the jump into journalism from the cannabis space is I really saw a need for more writing about it. And as I started to get that process underway, I realized that I couldn't really work in the industry and write about it and still write about it from the perspective that I wanted to write about.
Right, because if you're working in the industry, you might have some biases or your boss at like the dispensary or whatever. Did you work at a dispensary?
So at the time I was working at MCR Labs. So we had a wide clientele, and it probably wouldn't work out if I was, writing stuff about negative stuff.
Like testing labs or something like that. Yeah.
It's just way too much.
Well, yeah, exactly. Because now all the testing lab drama.
Right.
And all of a sudden you're employed by MCR. It's just like, this is a hit piece, get that guy off your team.
Yeah. So it would have been way too messy.
Yeah. The integrity of the journalist, of the actual writing itself would have been at question.
Right. Yeah. So going back to that, it actually started, I saw an ad, they wanted a columnist for Worcester Magazine, which is a magazine that's owned by the Telegram and Gazette, which is the major newspaper for Worcester. They were looking for a cannabis columnist, so I applied for that. And I think Burn After Reading was actually like the top choice for for the name of that column when I was asked, but I didn't want to use it for that project when I thought it might be more useful down the road. So we came up with Cannabis Confidential for that name.
Okay.
For that column, that was a weekly column in Worcester Magazine. It ran for about a year. And that was kind of how Burn After Reading started, because, I was in a print magazine. It was available online, but, it wasn't like a newsletter or stuff. So some people would be like, how do I subscribe to your column? Like, you have to subscribe to a newspaper or check the website every Friday.
Right.
So that
because you couldn't maybe just subscribe to Eric's work.
Right.
You have to subscribe to the whole newspaper at that point.
Yeah. It was a little bit of a more old-fashioned model, I guess. So people kept asking me that. So I created Burn After Reading just to basically have a way to send out that column every week and then give a little more extra for people who are particular fans of my work. So it kind of became a way to spread that. And then slowly over time, the freedom I had with Burn After Reading, I started to become more interested in that in the column at some point. And, the column ended up ending anyways when Worcester Magazine made some budget cuts to their freelance budget. So it was kind of worked out anyways that I already had Burn After Reading at that point and just kind of started running with that.
Now, do you thought, like, going into kind of the nuts and bolts, the little bit of the gear works of how it works a little bit? So your Cannabis Confidential segment or whatever piece is, column, was just axed entirely due to budget cuts.
Yes. Yep.
So do you, like, inside the newsroom, is your editor sending you stats like, hey, this column's working and this column's not working? Like, are you guys optimizing for, there's lots of things you could optimize for. You could optimize for the truth. Like, we only care about the truth and we have to get into the heart. Or are you optimizing for views because that's how we stay in business? Are you optimizing for something else? Like, so when you're in the newsroom and you're trying to decide what to write about next, is your editor being like, hey, every time we talk about MCR, RevClick, whatever, you get tons of views? Like, how does that work internally?
Yeah, so it depends on where you're at. When I was back doing the column for Worcester Magazine, I was a freelancer and I was one of a number of columnists, so they didn't really give me any stats or anything like that. I had pretty minimum interaction with them. But in terms of Worcester Business Journal, we don't really view it as like views or the stats, but we try to get beyond that and be like, what do our readers actually want? And obviously the stats give us some insight into that. So if it's something, completely frivolous, like there is some interesting things with the Business Journal model is like our intended demographic is business leaders, but when I write a story about a new Chick-fil-A opening in Worcester or something like that, obviously that's a business story, but when we put that onto Facebook, much more than like CEOs and executives are interested in that story. That's something that reaches the general public.
Yeah, the general public. So that's so interesting because you're really a B2B publication, whereas sometimes there's that C component, consumer component.
Yes.
So, I know there was a big, everybody's getting crazy that there's a Trader Joe's coming to Milford.
Right. Yep.
Right. So it was like, oh my God, that old space it was a Best Buy, a Staples or something, like it used to be a Staples, and now it's going to be a Trader Joe's, and everybody's free. So everybody's clicking on that article.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So it's driving tons of traffic to the website, and then obviously potentially could even convert to subscriptions and stuff like that too.
Yes. So tons of traffic, never a bad thing, but it is interesting writing for this publication where my main goal is to give insight to people who work in businesses in central Massachusetts. And sometimes through happy accidents, a story will get a lot of attention from the general public, and we obviously don't mind that, but it's not really our goal is to chase those views. It's really to give valuable insights.
Yeah, and so how does that work from a compensation standpoint? Do you get like extra dollars for views, or is it just you got a fixed salary?
Yeah.
That's just what it is.
Yeah, I got a fixed salary. Yeah.
So there's no incentive necessarily to always go after views for you. Right?
No.
You're always thinking about what's going to be the best story.
Right. Ultimately, it's like any other job where I'm trying to keep my bosses happy, basically, and they're not solely focused on views. They really want to make sure we're giving valuable insight to our main kind of readership. So,
and if you had to, like, out of your entire, I guess, career so far, is there any particular piece that you're like most kind of proud of?
That's really a hard question to answer for me personally. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different things. I mean, most recently, the big investigation that myself and Dan Adams, a freelancer that we brought on, who's an experienced drug policy reporter, did. That story took about 2 months at least, and like so many hours, just dozens of hours just on the phone talking to sources. A couple of 3 or 4 hour phone calls for sources, believe it or not. So that one is kind of fresh in mind, and obviously took a lot of work, and it's something I'm proud of. But there's a lot of stuff, I mean, I kind of like some of the more lighthearted stuff too. Like, I did a feature about candlepin bowling here in central Massachusetts, which is kind of a local.
It's so interesting. Yeah. Candlepin bowling does not exist outside of
right. Yes, it's only in New England.
Yeah.
So and it was looking like it was kind of going extinct for a while. A number of alleys were going out of business. Mm-hmm. But recently, some new ownership has come into that particular industry, and we've seen some new lanes open up for the first time in decades here.
New bowling lanes,
new candlepin bowling lanes.
Candlepins.
At the Apex Center in Marlboro, when they went up a few years ago, they were smart enough to put in a few candlepin lanes to meet that local clientele. And then there's a new candlepin center right next to Polo Park that's going in here in Worcester.
Really?
Out in Worcester, right
next to Polo Park.
Yes, it's going into a new mixed-use residential building that's under construction there, and it's supposed to be open this spring. So.
Yeah. Before we get too much into the Worcester side, because I do have a lot of questions around that, it's so funny that you say freelancer Dan Adams, because he was the cannabis reporter for the Boston Globe.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And he was, in my opinion, he was like a heavy hitter back then, because he was writing all the hard-hitting stories for the Boston Globe.
Yeah.
And then he got axed.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So nobody's safe if he can get axed.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But now he did this story with you.
Yep. Did
that launch yet?
Yes.
Okay.
So that's been out. So that went out late October, end of October. It was about 5,000 or 6,000 words on the Cannabis Control Commission. Very in-depth investigation into what's going on, talking to multiple sources off the record, which is something we rarely do at Worcester Business Journal, but we really needed to get at the story. So.
Yeah, so off-the-record sources, meaning that they're basically like, don't use my name, you never kind of talk to me, but here's what I know.
Right, people on background and off the record. So on background is when you somewhat identify them, you say like a source.
From MCR or whatever. Yeah, I'm sorry, MCR, I'm not actually picking on you. I just brought it up once, so I keep having that in my head.
Right, and then, talking to people completely off the record to kind of confirm details as well. That story took
2 months, you said?
Yeah. And that was while balancing my normal duties and trying to do everything else I do. So, that took a lot of work.
So hours and hours on the phone, just like contacting people, getting the story straight and stuff like that. I feel like and I think that's what a lot of people don't appreciate. It's that, people are quick to judge a journalist to be like, oh, he's got an agenda. He's trying to push this narrative, and that's why he's writing it this specific way. And when in reality, you're kind of being like, this took me 2 months to develop this. And I had to double check everything, cross my T's, dot my I's on every little detail, so we knew that we were doing the right thing here. And what was the big revelation, I guess, for that story?
Obviously people have been reporting on the commission for a while, but I guess the big revelation with that story is that there were multiple HR investigations at the time going on into the active executive director, Debbie Hilton Creek, and just a lot more insight and background into the infighting and sort of the chaos that has been going on internally in the commission in terms of how the workforce there is being treated and just overall problems that they're having. So.
Give me I'm so curious now. Give me a quick summary of it.
I mean, one of the things we found was that one of their own science-focused staff members was having trouble accessing testing data from the actual commission, kept asking for the testing data from the commission. Couldn't get it, and then went to a public presentation at a conference and saw somebody presenting the data that they had access to a public records request.
Yeah, like a FOIA.
Exactly.
Like that,
yeah. There was a point where the general public had better access to this data than somebody that actually
internally worked there. Yeah. So that's so interesting. And so I guess, obviously there's a lot of people who have their eyes on the commission right now, including, I guess, the legislature as well, just looking into them to be like, what are we doing here? And I think it was I'm going to say Attorney General, but what was what's the term for that person?
Inspector General?
Inspector General came out and said, we're thinking about putting this into receivership, taking it over. Mm-hmm. So, inside of your specific story, though, like we're talking about, I guess, more about the dysfunction of the CCC, of like how it's operating internally. Do we have any hope that it's going to get better? Like, what are we doing here?
Yeah, it's tough because obviously this has been a kind of a developing situation for years now at the commission. So, it's tough to say. I'm not particularly optimistic about the situation given what I've found and given kind of the reaction to some of the reporting, both that me and Dan did, but even the stuff before that, where it really feels like I haven't really seen a true commitment from the commission in terms of righting the ship, so to speak. And I do think this receivership discussion has been interesting to me because I think it's something that people at the commission are obviously trying to avoid. But at this point, I'm not sure how avoidable it is given the situation.
Yeah. And, when I talked to Commissioner Roy, it seems like there's a lot of things happening from her level as well. So Commissioner Roy was here basically to say that and I had so many questions and so many people asked me to ask these questions also on top of things. And, I've got business interests here, right? So I want to see my business succeed, but I also want to make sure that it's a level playing field. Like equal enforcement is one of the things that keeps on coming up. It's be like, hey, why do 17 inspectors show up to a 1,000 square foot store, and then a giant cultivation gets one inspector or whatever, and then you've got the opinions of them too. It's just like, hey, I think it should be like this, and then you have to be like, well, where in the regulations does it say I have to do this, right? I hear constantly from stories about that.
Yes.
And so, it's a regulation versus what's a guidance document. Like I've had that discussion about the 1,000 milligram products. So, it's so funny to think about and step back, because I've also been doing this since, full time since 2020 after I left my last job. And for being, 4 years into this, knowing what I know now, it seems so like there's so many low-hanging fruit to fix, but we're moving so slow sometimes. My bigger questions are now out of state. My big questions are, one of the things I wanted to ask Commissioner Roy, for instance, was, which I never got to, and I'm kicking myself I never did, but federal legality happens. What happens when Oregon is just like sending truckloads of weed across the country?
Right.
You know what I mean? Like there's just have this huge surplus there, right? And now they can go into other states that now can accept these things, right? Yeah. So I know the rules haven't been written and stuff like that, so nobody knows if that's even going to be allowed on day one. But I do know that there's a lot of, for instance, in Massachusetts, I get quotes sometimes about $5 a gram for distillate or something like that, right? A distillate is a raw core ingredient of our products. And a $5 a gram, we can still make money, but it's tight because, the price compression and stuff like that in the market. However, because our wholesale price is half of the retail price or even less sometimes, right? So if you're seeing a product on the shelf for like $100, we might get $50 for that product, but more likely we're probably getting like $30 or $35 for that product, and all that margin goes to the store. So, but of course, like if you have to pay $5 for 1 gram and it cost me $30 to make, and then I have to pay my staff and bottles and packaging and stuff like that, there's just a lot more that goes into it and so now now it's like we make a little bit of margin, enough to keep the lights on kind of stuff. But when I think about Oregon, I've seen prices as low as like 80 cents a gram for distillate. You know what I mean? Like we're talking about $800 a kilo of THC distillate, whereas right here it's $5,000, right? So it's like, it might, and I feel for cultivators sometimes, but I do feel like if it gets to the point where it is allowed to come in, and the cultivators in Massachusetts, or the extraction people anyways, are still charging $5 a gram, but I can get it for like $1, I'm going to buy it for $1.
Right.
It's the same plant, whether you grew it in the West Coast or the East Coast. Yeah. So now, like, even I'm looking beyond, because I'm just like, we're just going to operate in the rules they've been given us, and we're just going to continue to operate, and some things are going to be bad about it, and some things are going to be okay about it, right? I can't say there's anything great about any of the regulations, to be fair, because we're talking about increasing limits and stuff like that right now through the MCC. And you were at that meeting as well with me, the Massachusetts Cannabis Coalition. We were talking about, what would happen if we were to increase from 5 milligrams to 10 milligrams, or even just like going from 1 ounce per day to 2 ounces per day, just doubling it and getting in line with some of the other states that are coming online right now that do have higher MIC limits.
Yeah.
So with all that said, how do you regulate like all of that and continue to fix things along the way?
Yeah.
That's a tall order. And especially if, do they have budget for stuff? Like there should be all that tax revenue that's coming in. I know obviously some are allocated to the social equity grants and stuff like that, right? But they have budget to hire more people and stuff like that, I'm assuming, right?
You would think so, but yeah, I mean, that's kind of their pushback against some of the criticism is, they point the figure to the state legislature who controls the actual budget process and how much they get. They haven't got the requests that they've, put in the last year, at least maybe before that too, where they had some issues in terms of them asking for a certain amount and the legislature only giving them a certain amount. They point to the tax revenue that they bring in for the state, which is pretty significant when it comes to, the cannabis taxes. So that is part of the problem too, is like how much we actually budget to the state agency when we have all these other things going on in the state level outside of the cannabis world too that need to be funded. So that's something that kind of they've been battling with. I think a number of states are battling with in terms of how much resources do we put into this initially, how much of it needs to be funded through the taxes, or how much are we putting it up front to try to establish the industry before the tax revenue starts to come in. Which you see other states battling with in the immediate aftermath when they legalize. So that's one of the nuances that, I think state regulators have to deal with is that, even if they are bringing in significant tax revenue from cannabis sales, it doesn't always end up back in the agency's pocket.
Right. Well, I was going to say, because it's the highest taxed commodity or product in the state, right? Because there's a 6.25% sales tax, which everybody pays, or everybody gets gets. But then there's the excise tax on top of it of 11-ish%, and then, or 10, 11, I can't remember the actual numbers. Dispensaries probably know this by heart, obviously.
Right.
And then there's the 3%, up to 3% local tax also. So now we're sitting at a 20% tax.
Please.
So local gets 3%. The state gets its 6.25%, 6.5%. I can't remember, never remember sales tax. And then the specific excise tax on marijuana sales is like 11%, right? And so now that we've generated billions of dollars in cannabis sales, you can only imagine that's hundreds of millions of dollars. So it's like, that's a lot of dough that's being created through taxes in the state of Massachusetts, and they're not able to necessarily get all that budget back.
Right, exactly, yeah.
So it's going to fund other things, whether it's schools and stuff like that, of course, which we want to fund, but it's more of just, it's an interesting situation that you've been put in. Now, what do you think of those things where it comes to like the executive director search, right? So it's like, we currently still don't have an executive director. We have an acting executive director.
Right.
And the person that they selected backed out. Right. Do you have any insights like, why did that person back out?
No, unfortunately. Apparently, this was revealed during the latest Cannabis Control Commission. Apparently, David Lakeman, who's the person who backed out, gave a statement to the commission that is apparently you would think has more details than the one he gave to the Boston Globe, which was very brief and didn't really get into the explanation. Commissioner Roy became aware of this apparent statement and during the meeting asked for it to be made part of the public record. Acting Chair Stebbins deferred to Acting Executive Director Debbie Hilton Creek, who's involved in the hiring process, and she said, we'd have to check with David to see if he's comfortable releasing that statement, which, you think he would be because it's a statement.
Right. I think you could imagine he's like, I'm doing maybe clear, very statement so it can be shared.
Yeah. So
but they were like, let's not share it until we go with him, exactly. Which is kick the can down the road a little bit.
Who knows if we'll ever have any follow-up on that. Maybe Commissioner Roy will.
Well, that's the thing. It's always through FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act. So it's basically saying, if anybody's, I filed a FOIA before just to see how it works. But basically, and I think I did it for a list of the hemp licensors for MDAR. Because MDAR wasn't publishing a list of all the licensees back in the day. And so I did a FOIA request, and I got it like 6 months later, like a full list of every hemp producer in Massachusetts. And Freedom of Information Act basically says that like you make this request and there's some timeline attached to it, maybe of like when they actually have to get back to you with an answer.
Yes.
But most anything that the commission is doing, or actually, of the commission, the regulatory body here, you can request that data. It's, for the most part, unless and they maybe redact a few things depending on if it's sensitive information, like PII, personal identity information can't be in there. You can't necessarily state specific names and social security numbers and stuff like that. So they'll black all that stuff out. But it's like, it's funny because I do feel like a lot of cannabis companies will say, we're building the airplane as we fly it. Right. And I feel like that's the commission too. It's just like they're figuring it out too. Like they don't have all the answers right away, but it's funny because people are like, well, it's a nefarious organization. They're like doing all these things on purpose. I think they're doing it because it's chaos. Right. And this industry is just chaos for all of us. Right. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So when it comes to the executive director search, they now pass that to Travis Ahern.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And he has or has not accepted it yet.
As far as I know, as of recording right now, he has not accepted it. There has to be a negotiation process, which is apparently where things broke down. With Wigman is that they have to come up with a salary. I think they're asking for a lot for anybody who comes into this role right now.
I would imagine you're going to be highly compensated simply because it's chaos.
Right. And when Sean Collins left, he was making around $200,000 a year. So I think that's probably the range that a lot of people who apply for the job are expecting. Whether or not they're getting that in negotiations, I guess we'll find out at some point.
This is all public record too, because even the one thing about Travis Ahern, he's currently the town manager or town admin, I can't remember which title, of Holliston, which is right next door to us. And I've met him a few times. I've met him a bunch of times. So I'm a big fan of Travis. I think he's a great guy. But his previous salary or his existing salary as the town manager is public, and now this is public. So you can
that's true.
You can kind of see like what he's asked for from the town, and towns obviously have limited budgets too.
Yeah.
Wow, it's just like that's what I see as kind of one of those. You can't make this stuff up. It's like it was in a movie. Yeah. Like, we got a new executive director, David Lakeman, and then all of a sudden he's like, I'm good. Mm-hmm. And then now Travis Ahern has been up, to that next level, and we don't know if he's going to accept it or not. Yep. And now looking forward to 2025, because we're at the end of the year now. Yep. In 2025, like, will we have a functioning internal? I'm not talking about the commissioners themselves, right? Because I think a lot of people get that confused also. It's like the commissioners are a different level of the actual people who are doing the day-to-day work, right? Whether they're investigators, licensing people, executive director, et cetera. It took me, in my brain, a long time to figure out like what these individual roles meant, and I'm still not 100% clear on a lot of this stuff, right? Because it's just so convoluted the way it was kind of structured and put together. But in 2025, are you seeing like any big trends kind of emerging, like that you've been kind of like following maybe in 2024 that you think are going to be more popular in 2025?
I think we're going to continue to see some of the consolidation we've seen here in Massachusetts, especially on the cultivation side of things, just because I think there was too much product and not enough to do with it.
Do you track any of the glut of the commoditized version of the cannabis plant anyway?
You try to, based on what public data is out there, and you also see the price compression, which is kind of an obvious sign of oversupply, because I don't think the demand has really gone anywhere. I think people are still interested in this product. I think there was just a lot of flower on the market, and a lot of it not quality enough to be to bring good prices in terms of being sold as flowers. So and it's interesting to see the Massachusetts market as it's developing over all of these years, and you see brands like Jeter come in and they crush it right at the ballpark because they have an existing brand. Yeah, right. And so when you think of Jeter, you think, okay, with all of the funding they have and the presence they have, they should be able to put out a really good product. I've never tried their product, but I would say that, like, based on their branding and packaging and stuff like that, it seems like one of those premium products we've been waiting for in Massachusetts, right? Mm-hmm. Cookies kind of started out that way, but even their stores are just okay. Yeah. The Worcester one, anyways, I look at their numbers occasionally and I'm just like, should we be in that store? Should we not be in that store? And we debated because we already had a bunch of stores in Worcester already. But when I look at 2025, especially the cultivation, that's a really good point. I do feel that what I'm hearing from dispensary owners right now is that their transactions are going up. Mm-hmm. It's just that the average basket is going down. And so people are just buying more of the same stuff they were buying before at less, less cost. Yeah. But I would say consolidation is definitely a big one in 2025. What about like consolidation in terms of, I guess, the businesses themselves, like the brands, because we just heard of Rev Clinics closing everything but their dispensaries. And I have gotten some confirmed sources for all these things. And I know a lot of people who commented on my post regarding that one. Right. Were saying like, I'm basically, my days are up in January or something like that. Like it's basically the end of it. Yeah. For such a large brand, right, to come in, really do tons and tons of revenue. And obviously they have, there's been changes of leadership and stuff like that over there. And for them to basically to stop cultivation, product manufacturing, I feel like there's some brands like Kiva, I think, is with them, right? So there's some brands that are going to have to find new homes maybe. Yeah, David Ortiz's brand.
Yeah, Poppy, the Poppy brand. So, and that had its own craziness regarding their legal issues together, because I think Rev and Poppy weren't getting together on certain things, and then it all got squashed and they all kept on moving forward with it. And they, were basically back on good terms as of like a month ago. And then all of a sudden it's like, well, we don't exist anyway, so whatever,
Yeah.
So it pains me to see kind of closes like that, because there's a lot of, this is one of the reasons why I wrote that post, is because there's a lot of talented people out there, and you have to separate the company from the people who work there. You just have to. Despite what you think about Rev, there are really talented and lovely people who work there, right? Not all of them, of course, because you always have some bad eggs occasionally.
Yeah.
But like, there's a lot of really great people, and if I could hire them all and like have that, then I would have that. But we're tiny. Our facility is 1,800 square feet here. We are one of the smallest ones, basically, in Massachusetts. But I go back to the trend in 2025 of staying lean, right? Staying tight.
Yeah.
We're not out of the woods yet. As much as people had, turned a corner maybe in 2024 a little bit and survived 2024. Kudos for surviving 2024. But 2025, you're not out of the woods yet. You got to keep on, staying tight with your money. Payroll is one of the biggest expenses you're going to have.
Yeah.
But how about any stories that are developing right now? Or, I mean, you probably can't speak maybe specifics, but like, are you covering any of the lab testing? And Commissioner Roy actually called it she actually called it fraud.
Yeah.
Lab testing fraud.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's also a huge story. That's something that the Business Journal was covering even before I came on and kind of boosted our cannabis coverage a little bit. I think it's really important, and it's really something that can be hard to have a rational conversation about it, because you both have like this very legitimate public safety concern in terms of products that are contaminated or have high yeast or mold levels getting onto the market. And then you also have this flip side of things where we might be testing for things that we haven't proven are actually dangerous to humans. We're testing for all yeast and mold, not specific pathogens that are dangerous to human beings. So I think there's this another side of thing where something might fail for total yeast and mold, and people are freaking out. But it's like, well, is that yeast and mold actually something dangerous? Or, so it's really hard to kind of wrap your head around on so many levels, because there's the science aspects of it, but then there's also is like, are we actually implementing the science correctly? Is the testing protocols being followed? Are they strict enough? Are they universal enough so that we don't have labs even using completely different methods, which has been a problem here in the past here in Massachusetts. So it's a really nuanced subject, and it's interesting because it's capturing a lot of public debate, but I think it's really only going to get attention outside the cannabis world and get kind of national attention with, we have seen the Wall Street Journal and other publications write about this topic already, but I think eventually if so many markets across the country are having these issues, there's going to be some sort of, major issue at some point where people start actually getting sick or tragically even dying. And I think that's the point where people will start paying attention. And it's sad that it has to get to that point.
Yeah.
But that's the path we're heading down if we don't correct this situation.
Well, that's really interesting that you say that, because I'm thinking that might have to, might be the way that we trigger this whole discussion at a wider level. Hopefully it's not Massachusetts that actually triggers it, but because I agree with you, it's more of a nuanced thing, because, I hear from cultivators who are like, well, we need to raise these limits, not eliminate these limits on specific ones. And then, people who from the outside being like, oh, lab testing, you got to eliminate everything from the product. And it's like, well, it's a plant, and the plants that you grow in farms just have yeast and mold on them. They just have little particles. And so what are safe levels, but also is it even a toxic one? Like, is it a mycotoxin, or is it like something that is completely inert for humans?
Yeah.
So lab testing, I think, is definitely going to come to a head at some point. Hopefully we sort it out before anybody actually gets hurt or harmed.
Yes.
So you already talked a little bit about the line between industry and journalism, because you're taking a probing from the outside, right? Try to find the truth, really, yes, right? Yep. So, like, do you get people like whistleblowers coming to you?
Yes, yeah. That's really how the original investigation into the Cannabis Control Commission started. Was a random email in my inbox from somebody I didn't know, and I kind of overlooked it in the first couple hours after it, because it was, it was during a meeting. I was working on other stories, so I'm like, I'll check in on that this afternoon when I have some more time. And then when I read the email, I was like, wow, this is coming from inside the house, so to speak. Like, this is somebody who clearly knows
at the CCC.
At the CCC.
Wow.
And that source led to another source and led to another source. And One critical part of that story that I think made it, impactful as it was that I was talking to people who were kind of on multiple different sides of the different schisms that have formed within the commission. Because there's been a lot of different disagreements, things that have escalated into HR complaints and all sorts of allegations from one employee to another. The interesting thing that was really critical about this story that, I think gave it this impact was I was talking to people on different sides of these schisms, and even perhaps they didn't realize this, but they kind of agreed fundamentally on what the issues were at the commission and what needed to change. So that was kind of very interesting to me that these two people that if you got in the same room, they probably hate each other, but they actually agree with each other on kind of the fundamental issues that need to be solved before the commission could actually move forward.
I feel like you need just strong leadership, though.
Yeah.
That's what it comes down to. Somebody who's going to make the decisions like, no, we're going to do this. And I think that a lot of government agencies can easily fall into that trap of well, it's not my job to fix things, so I'm just going to wait for it to happen to me. Very passive approach, but we need an active leader, I think. And I think that's part of make the change.
Yeah, I think that's the issue. This has been sort of a leadership vacuum. I think part of it is the structure, because people are trying to figure out, is the executive director in charge of the commission?
Who has control over this? Yeah, and that's the crazy thing.
About this,
and when I was talking to Commissioner Roy, it came up because we were talking about vertical deintegration, and we were talking about the ability for, just to hold a medical license for manufacturing, because it's something that I got into this industry for medical reasons,
right.
And so I always wanted to have a medical license. It's very cost prohibitive, $50,000 a year just for the license, right? But you also have to have cultivation, manufacturing, and retail. You have to have all three pillars in order to even be there, because it's called vertical integration. Yep. But if we de-verticalize and break them up, then I can just have a manufacturing, because I don't want to be a cultivator.
Right.
Somebody asked me, actually this morning, 5 o'clock this morning, I got this on LinkedIn. Someone was like, hey, would you want to buy all the Revs cultivation with me? And I'm like, sounds like a great idea. I'm not a cultivator.
Right.
I'm actually really bad at growing. And I take the philosophy when I start companies, especially to learn every role in the company, so I just know how everything works, so I can fix things too. I just love, every week I try to focus on one department to just take care of their problems,
Mm-hmm.
go to the next one, take care of their problems, and I can't do that unless I know kind of what's going on deep down.
Right.
Of course I can learn cultivation, but I get too much on my plate right now.
Right.
But I do feel so the de-vertical integration, Commissioner Roy is well, it's legislature. You actually have to pass a bill,
mm-hmm.
right? So it has nothing to do with regulations at that point. They're fine with it. It's nothing to do with them. But it's yes, of course they can put pressure on it,
yeah,
and move things along maybe by making a few phone calls. But that's kind of their only kind of outlet at that point. And then that comes down to advocates, though. It's the advocates have to be up in arms enough. I know people have been pushing the de-vertical integration. But yeah, same thing internally also. Yes. It's who's in charge of this?
Right.
Executive director, what is their function? What is their role? And what are their guardrails? And then what is the commission's guardrails on top of that? And how do they work together? And even the staff underneath it, the inspectors, the licensing people, the whole reporting thing of it. I know there's a new executive, I think Commissioner Roy actually mentioned this to me. There's a new executive investigations, I believe, as of a year-ish ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I know one of the things they're going to be looking at is equal enforcement, trying to make sure that it is equally enforced. And it's not just an opinion of one of the inspectors, for instance, versus an actual, it's the regulation. Because I, hear horror stories from everybody, especially, I've heard a few from Worcester specifically.
Yeah. Okay.
But let's get to Worcester actually really quickly.
Yeah, sure.
I'm a WPI grad.
Okay, great. Yeah.
Yeah.
I heard about that.
WPI.
Yeah.
WPI, really, really great college, Institute of Technology. And being that computer nerd, I always wanted a home somewhere where I could be with peers who are just computer nerds, right? I never had that growing up, and I was WPI is my home. So, love WPI. I never ventured off campus.
Yeah. So you were not.
I was
insulated. Yeah, you're not alone in that.
So now I'm looking at, now you are a journalist for also the real estate component of business and of businesses in Worcester as well. And so when I think about, you were just talking about bringing Kendall Penn Bowling back to a place next to Polar Park, which is the minor league Red Sox stadium.
Yes.
And when I think of that, I think to myself, just I love cities like that. Just like you've got like Candlepin Bowling randomly, and they're like, hey, I'm going to do Candlepin Bowling. I'm going to go watch the game, right? I'm going to go hit that bar, go hit this restaurant. Everything's walkable, right? How is that? Is Worcester slowly on the up and up? I know there's the Canal District also, which you've been doing some coverage on recently. And I think Major Bloom, I think, is in the Canal District. I just had Ulysses on as well. And he was talking about some of the challenges of people nodding off like in their vestibule up front, being like, and you just have to like call the police, to come help the person. But are you at least hopeful of Worcester's kind of future?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's funny because like Polar Park has become the most polarizing.
Oh, really?
In Worcester, because it represents a lot of things. It represents a huge amount of change. I mean, it's interesting. You can go on Google Earth and look at that region 10 years ago versus what it looks like now. Where Polar Park was built was a giant empty lot that was contaminated from prior manufacturing use. So that whole
is it a super
site? Fun site. So it got cleaned up, and they built the most expensive minor league ballpark in history on top of it.
Now, where did that funding come from?
A variety of sources, but basically the city is kind of paying for it over the course of 30 years. Funds raised from real estate taxes in the district and meal taxes and ticket revenue and a few other things is supposed to pay off the whole cost of the park, which they are kind of leasing to the team for 30 years. So that whole neighborhood has been changed a lot, but it's kind of this work in progress. And it's funny, the whole idea, if you build it, they will come. We're kind of seeing if that turns out to be true for the
how fitting that it's based.
Exactly. Yeah, it's because right now they're building that same building the Candlepin alley is going, and it's called the Cove. It's a mixed-use building, a luxury residential apartment building built right next to the ballpark. You can literally look out your window and watch the ball game from the place. And it's got the most expensive rents in central Massachusetts. We're seeing rents that are it depends on what you're looking at. There's all sorts of deals going on right now too as they're trying to bring people into the building. But you're looking at up to like $4,000 for a 2-bedroom apartment, which in Worcester is more than kind of double what you're typically seeing. And they're really trying to attract people out from Boston who are in the Seaport District perhaps and paying way more than that for rent. And they're like, wow, I could live out in Worcester, take the train into work when I need to go into the office and live in this beautiful brand new building overlooking the minor league ballpark. So that's kind of, they're trying to bring in more residents who have a higher net worth and more income, which
to spend money in the city.
Money would help build, grow that district and help pay off for the ballpark, which, sounds great, but then you have long-term residents in Worcester who are kind of shocked at the cost of some of these, rents in these buildings. And, that neighborhood in particular, just because you build luxury apartments doesn't make the neighborhood luxurious. So they are having issues with people who are experiencing homelessness or drug addiction who live in that area. So you can, you might walk out your very expensive apartment and see somebody really struggling right across the street from it at this moment. So
it's really gentrification.
Yeah, gentrification basically. And trying to, obviously, you can't freeze any community in time. If your community isn't growing, it's probably dying. People are probably going to move away if there's not opportunity there. So you have to constantly kind of create new opportunities in cities if you want to see them grow. But, that impact on the long-term residents is obviously already beginning to happen. And it's having all sorts of different impacts. And I think it's a work in progress. And I think even 30 years from now, when that lease is up, we're still probably going to be debating the impact and whether or not it was good.
It was worth it.
Yeah. So it's been a very fascinating topic, but as a journalist, it's been great because it's this chain of headlines and news stories coming out of that.
Yeah. And I think, you can basically determine if it was worth it on a financial sense, right? Because you can say like, did we even pay the loan back? Yeah. 30 years and all that stuff. But like the societal impact is a different measurement, which is much harder.
Right. And obviously, if any big plan, anything you do in life even, you never know what would happen if you didn't make that decision. So that's where that debate always lives, is no matter how successful or not successful that area is, there's always going to be this argument of what would happen if we didn't do this. So that's kind of where the argument lies in terms of, would that area still just be a giant open contaminated parking lot, or would more development came organically, even if we did?
Exactly. And if Worcester didn't front the money to get it all done, the city itself.
Yep.
What's your go-to, I guess? Like, any shout out to any businesses that you like in that area?
In terms of cannabis or just
anything? Yeah.
Yeah, I think in general, Major Bloom has been very successful. I think, Bud's Goods is another locally owned brand that has had a lot of success there. It's funny because, you had True Leaf come into the Worcester and a few other MSOs, including Mission, who I actually worked for back in the day. And it's kind of been a mixed bag. Obviously, Trulieve left Worcester and then left the whole state as well.
Right.
It just kind of proves that you kind of do need that local connection. So I think that's part of the reason why Buds and Major Bloom have had so much success. But overall, in Worcester, I'm a fan of the businesses who've been there for a long time. There's a bar called Vincent's that's been there. It's a dive bar that's been there forever and hopefully is always there. So I kind of like those older school feeling places that have been there for a long time and have that local connection. So
well, that's the balance of gentrification, right? Right. All this money's coming in, luxury condos, people coming from the seaport to live in Worcester now. Maybe they have better commutes and stuff like that and all this other stuff because, maybe they just like being a nice walkable city. But then you've got Vincent's who might be that unfortunate side effect of like, well, the rent's going to go up for him now, or Vincent's, whoever Vincent is. And, the Vincent's family who's owned it for 80 years or whatever, that rent's going up and now they have to leave.
Right.
So there's that balance and like maybe, they raise their prices, but it's a dive bar. Like how do you raise prices? $2 peavers? Like who doesn't want to $2?
That's what you're for. Exactly.
So I do feel for those businesses because, you work your entire life on something and then you get basically your rent doubles and you're like, well, what do I do now?
Right. Yeah, we're seeing that a lot. Worcester, sadly right now, Redemption Rock Brewery, which is one of the more successful craft brewers in the space, and if you go in there any Friday or Saturday night, is a very busy place. They're shutting down for good on December 29th, unfortunately, because they haven't been able to compete. Talk about another industry that has its struggles right now and is facing consolidation. And they've been a kind of a staple of the local community for the last 6 years that they've been open. So it's really devastating to see them kind of.
Did they cite rent increases?
I'm sure I know they've had some landlord issues. I think that plays a role in it. I also think it's just the craft beer space. Unfortunately, right now, you're seeing a ton of consolidation. You're seeing a lot of people move away from alcohol in general, but also specifically craft beer, which is very high in carbs. People are kind of doing the seltzer thing nowadays. So.
Don't get me started. I have lots of insights into the decline of alcohol. So, but I do feel for companies like that because it's like, we spent 6 years, you built this business, and now all of a sudden our rent doubles, and now we got to either charge our customers way more, and then we're going to, reduction in, revenue from that because they're not going to come in anymore, and then you close up shop. And I think, that's what, that's sometimes that. It's the nature of business, right? You could be open for 6 years and the next day you're like, I got to close because I can't do it anymore. And, without knowing the full story, I can't obviously comment any deeper than that. But I do feel like, that's when maybe the MSO of the beer world comes in, right? Somebody who has a chain of brew pubs or something like that comes in and takes that space because it's already built now.
Yeah, it's possible. Yeah. And we've seen some of that happen in the craft beer space in Worcester too, with Wormtown, which is one of them. Probably more well-known brands here in Massachusetts. They were bought out by the Jack's Abbey's parent company. So we've seen some consolidation in the craft beer space too. So it's kind of been interesting to see that as well.
Yeah. And so, that adds to, especially if you're one of those smaller companies, it adds to the charm of that city because they've been there.
Exactly. And that's kind of what created this initial interest in Worcester, which is kind of the sad thing is there was a lot of cool cultural things. I think we've seen this elsewhere, like Brooklyn is probably a good example. There's been cities all over the country where they get this reputation of being cool all of a sudden because there's cool things happening organically there because rent prices are low. It attracts people, who are artistic and don't prioritize profit, they prioritize, having an interesting life. And that's where you get places like Redemption Rock and other cool cultural institutions that kind of create all this buzz around a city. And then you see the investors come in and try to capitalize on that. Right. And then sometimes they end up kind of killing the golden goose, the goose that lays the golden egg, so to speak.
Yeah, they go in, they buy the property from underneath them and they're like, okay, now we're going to lease it back to you for like twice as much. Yeah, Brooklyn, that's definitely something that was happening in Brooklyn. Brooklyn is large, surprisingly large. I don't think people realize how sometimes big Brooklyn is, and there's so many different little side segments.
Yeah.
I lived in Crown Heights. Okay. And in my rent for a 3-bedroom when I was there was like $2,700. And we had access to everything. Manhattan was like 15 minutes away by subway. Just hop on the subway and then just pop into Manhattan and you're there. And then we had all those local breweries and stuff like that were popping up.
Yeah.
We can go to Red Hook or Brooklyn Brewery or whatever. And it has all that charm, which is what I'm missing in the suburbs now. Yeah. And I do feel like we're here and we have family here and all that stuff and it's great. But I do miss that kind of like walkable city charm.
Right.
Of just exploring and finding something new, like a random game shop. And we're not talking about video games, but like board games and all, chess, people playing chess outside and stuff. You're like, oh, what's that all about? Like, let's go explore that now,
Yeah. And there's a balance there, because as you mentioned in Worcester, when you were going to college there, you didn't venture out. I'm sure a lot of people didn't venture out because it was like...
I went to the Boynton, and that's about it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because like there was fears about safety and a lot of other things. There wasn't a lot going on in the city.
This is the 90s.
Yeah. There wasn't a lot. So there's a balance. There's probably a sweet middle ground between, kind of a depressing city where there's not much going on and where you have all this investor interest. But we just did a big real estate issue kind of recap on how the real estate market is in central Massachusetts, looking at not only residential, but also office and industrial. And one of the takeaways that I had, which is really surprising, was like the average Worcester 1 to 2 star apartment, which means like an apartment, 1 star is like falling apart.
Oh, wow.
Building that needs a ton of work. 2 stars like barely livable.
Whose stars are these?
So this is something that I think CoStar comes up, like it's a big real estate firm. It's one of those things. It's it's meant to be a guide. It's not this makes it a 1 star. This is like kind of. You do your best you can to fit these various properties into these these boxes.
So 1 star is falling apart.
Yeah, 1 star is falling apart. 2 stars, livable. There's it's triple decker. That's not the nicest triple decker. It hasn't been renovated in 50 years or whatever, but it's livable. And 1 star is something that like really people shouldn't be living in. Needs a lot of work to be something that you could live in. The rent for these apartments in Worcester, 1 to 2 star, is at the national average for a 3 star apartment, but it's your average apartment. So basically, you can invest in Worcester and get rent prices that is for, what would be for like a medium level apartment anywhere else in the country. In Worcester, you can get premium rents for non-premium properties, basically, at this point.
It's almost like slumlord style.
Yeah, sadly.
Like I just don't have to even invest in this property.
Right.
People will still pay a 3 star price for it.
Right, yeah, because it's sad, because there are, people that actually go into properties that really wouldn't have any use unless they're going to be renovated. Renovate them, they charge a little more than they would have gotten for rent previously at that place, but they actually are fixing up these neighborhoods, and then you have other people who are just buying these properties.
Are you seeing people that are, like, leaving the city?
There's, Worcester's population has been pretty strong, even with some of the slight decline we've seen in the state in terms of people kind of fleeing. I think, Worcester's population still growing. It's the only gateway city in Massachusetts that still has a growing population.
So it's a growing population, which means that businesses should be investing in Worcester.
Yeah, they should be. Yeah, I think it's still a pretty strong market. You just have a lot of people who are living there who are struggling with cost of living, which is sadly something that's not unique to Worcester at this point in the country. But you have a lot of long-term residents there who are seeing higher prices at the grocery store, higher rents, and their incomes aren't rising at the same level to match that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's always the struggle, right? It's inflation. It's just everything goes up in price, and you're not getting a raise, and now you're like, what do I do now? Because now more and more of my salary is going to, or my paycheck is going towards groceries,
right,
and stuff like that. So what about getting back onto cannabis really quickly? Because you mentioned that Worcester's population is growing. Do you think the cannabis industry, specifically in Massachusetts, still has room to grow?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, in terms of employee counts, I think we might be reaching a peak. I should probably, keep a closer look on some of those stats as we go into 2025, because I imagine with some of the layoffs we're seeing, we might not see as many people working in the industry as we have in previous years.
Well, there's definitely people leaving. Yeah, it's announcing it, being like, I'm out. Yeah. You guys have fun with cannabis, I'm out.
Right, and it's hard to blame them at this point.
Yeah.
It really is.
As after all the abuse and who knows what people have to go through, because you hear horror stories all the time to the point where, a person has died in Massachusetts now. Yeah. Right? So,
Worker safety is a huge issue in the industry. So, it depends what metric you're using to measure growth, I guess, at the end of the day. But I think it's be harder to find that growth than it was in previous years, where there was just kind of endless green space to grow into. So I think, and when you have all these other markets coming online in the country, I think there's going to be more interest in other markets. What I'm hearing from people in the state is it's really hard to attract investors who are looking at the industry on a national level, because there's just markets that are way more appealing.
Right now, and New York is finally starting to figure some of this stuff out. Although the OCM and there's lawsuits galore still, and you have to really tread carefully in New York. Mm-hmm. But I mean, I think travel agency, Unisquare Travel Agency, which started in close to Union Square. Is that Union Square? Yeah, that's kind of that's Union Square. And now I think they just opened their 4th store or something like that. And I can't remember where it was. It was like Brooklyn or something like that. But you're seeing, there's no limit of 3 for them. Right. Apparently, I didn't realize that. I never looked at the OCM docs that much, but now that's their 4th store.
Yeah.
And so I do find like there's a lot more opportunity in places like New York City, because we know that New York City, or New York, I should say in general, because, you know, there's Albany and Buffalo and all these other spots in New York that are also quite large, is going to be competing with the scale of like California.
Yeah.
Because it has a ton of people.
Right.
There's just so many people.
Yeah.
And, you know, and actually speaking of New York, relaying this back to Massachusetts a little bit, do you have any numbers on like the legacy market? Like, that's something I'd be interested in seeing. It's like, well, speaking about growth in Massachusetts specifically, is the legacy market shrinking, or is it growing, or is it just kind of steady?
That's a good question. Yeah, I wish we had more solid numbers on that. I would have to guess it's shrinking.
Yeah, there's nobody collecting that, being like, hey, every street corner,
right?
Yeah, street corner is like an old way of thinking.
Yeah,
but like, so how much weed did you sell today? You know,
right? I think it is. I mean, anecdotally, like when I walk through Worcester's neighborhood, sadly, and this is something I might do a story on at some point because it's reached that point. The most common litter I see in the gutters of Worcester, no matter what neighborhood I'm walking through, is pre-roll containers at this point. It's probably surpassed, you know, the little bottles of alcohol you commonly see.
That's so interesting.
It's really one of the more common pieces of litter I see now. And so I think that's good insight that, you know, that the legacy market isn't what it used to be, at least in Worcester. But at the same time, it's hard to quantify, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, it's super hard to quantify, obviously, but because that would like give some more indication of like, you know, if you've been buying it from your dealer for 20 years, are you going to just up and leave because there's a store that opened like a mile and a half away?
Right.
Maybe not. You still might have the convenience of delivery or something like that, because speaking in New York City, you know, back when, you know, I was living there as late as 2017, I see cards like delivery drivers like, hey, I'll just get weed delivered. It was just like everywhere already. So it was basically already legal. Like cops would be walking around. They wouldn't care. Right. You know what I mean? Unless they wanted to make trouble, and then they would be like, hey, that's, you know, they'll be on you about it. But unless there's no reason to bust you, then they would just kind of like leave you alone. Mm-hmm. But I feel like knowing more about the Massachusetts market than when I started, knowing what I know now, I feel like there are pockets of growth, but I agree with you where it's going to be harder to find these pockets. Right. So it's just like, of course, new people are going to be entering the market. One of our products specifically, I get people all the time like, I haven't had cannabis. Last time I had cannabis, I had this conversation literally over the weekend. One of the parents was over my house, they were dropping their daughter off, and we had to get to talking. And he's like, oh yeah, the last time I had it was my buddy's wife made a batch of like brownies or something like that. And I didn't know what was in it. So I took a whole brownie. I didn't realize it. And then I was watching the Discovery Channel, like glued to my chair. And I was just like, yep. Like, or you could just try our product, which is precisely dosed. Yeah. You know exactly how much you're getting, you know? So I do feel for people like that. But I also think, you know, at some point you're just going to have to walk into a dispensary. Yeah. You know what I mean? Or get delivery, you know, from our friends like Rolling Relief and Deliver It Inc., et cetera. So there's other ways to get access to it now that you don't have to even leave your home. Right.
Yes. And then we have social consumption eventually, allegedly coming on, you know, being available here in Massachusetts.
Yeah. So I just did that panel.
Okay.
With Laurie, Lucien, Todd Down, and Chris Ferrone. What are your thoughts on social consumption? We can kind of like wrap after this part, because I'm really curious. Social consumption, it's almost like not a green rush. I think people are more level-headed when it comes to this, like most people, but there are definitely some people out there like, oh, I can't wait to open up this, you know, big club and we're all going to be smoking weed together. And I think to myself, well, why would I go somewhere else to smoke weed?
Yes. I
can just smoke weed in my house and I don't have to be bothered by anybody. Right. You know what I mean? But then you have people like Todd who are like, I've been in music and promotion and, you know, I've launched bands and stuff like that for so long, and artists that like, I know how to run all this stuff, and it's not going to be like that. It's going to be like this. Yeah. Right. So I look to that and be like, that seems like a great idea if you can pull it off that way, especially the event type. Yeah. You can just have like a 1-day event or a 5-day event. And you just get your license and now there's consumption on site. Right. But then it opens up a whole new can of worms because now you have to be trained on how to recognize impairment. Right. Because, you know, we're talking about in the dispensaries, I don't think they're not trained with that stuff, tips training, right? They're just like, hey, I'm here to like, I'm trained on how to recognize like an ID to be valid. Yeah. But not necessarily like, is that person impaired? Yeah. Or should I sell them anymore? You know? what's your take on social consumption? Is it a failed license type? Is it like, does it have some uses?
It's a good question. It's going to be hard to pull off. I'm a little skeptical of the overall concept. I think I share the same skepticism you kind of expressed there when it like, are we going to change people's consumption habits? If someone's used to, consuming cannabis at their home or what have you, are they actually going to go to these places? And then you also have the reality of like public consumption and the fact, states like Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, after that legalized after us have figured this out where you can smoke anywhere, you can smoke cigarettes legally. Here in Massachusetts, it's not quite the same.
It's not public consumption. Yeah,
right. It's technically illegal, or it's not allowed. You won't end up in jail, but you'll be fined technically if the cops decide to fine you. But as we know, enforcement on that has not been very strong.
Yeah.
Right? So you have this reality of like if you're going out on the night and you're going to a restaurant or something, and you're on the way there with friends, and you get out of the car and it's a 10-minute walk, you can easily just consume a joint on the way there. Get to the restaurant and everything's very fine and normal. So like, the idea we're going to create a whole, business model around this, I'm a little skeptical. And then you have the regulations, which are also going to be a bit of a damper if you have to.
Well, because there's already private clubs.
Right. And there's the Summit Lounge.
Yeah. It's a perfect example in Worcester. They're not selling you anything, right? It's BYOC, but it's still like a place where you can go for consumption. So, because it's a private club now, exactly. But but bars exist.
Yes,
right. Why do people go to bars?
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
So it's like because you want something new, neat, interesting. You also want food with it, environment. And I think of places like Free Play, like the arcade games and stuff like that. And there's definitely scenarios where I think that would be interesting. And I do feel like the supplemental side of it, where it's just like, because one of the things that I had mentioned on the panel, which I thought was really interesting, is if we were able to get ours, which I still have to qualify for social equity, which I think I qualify for. I just never applied for it. I think the supplemental one, which is where I can actually have like a mini kind of like tasting room, would be helpful for me, because right now we're in an area where there's a bunch of no towns around us. And the only town that's close to us, well, Franklin is probably the best example of like where our products are right now. But our closest store is Comcan in Millis. And they're pretty clear that they won't carry our products anymore. They tried it before to be kind of like, hey, we're nice neighbors, and now it hasn't. They've haven't taken us in since, and so we're in this big kind of no town, and they won't take our products in. So all the people who I talk to, they're like, where do I go to buy your products? And it's like, you know what I mean? You got to send them all. So if I could just have like a little tasting room here, I'd be like, hey, try it. You can't leave with it, right? But we can make this big, Kool-Aid or whatever you want to call it, jungle juice punch, and people can kind of sample like what it feels like and what it tastes like and stuff like that for our products. So I think that's interesting, kind of like a winery,
right?
You know what I mean? Here's how we make it, and then you go to the last place and there's a little bar. You just get served a few samples and you're done. Nothing crazy. I'm not trying to create people with have impairment. I'm literally just giving them a taste so they know what it tastes like. So when they can go to the store, they can buy it. You know what I mean?
Right.
So I think cases like that, the event one, the supplemental one, I think are really interesting. But the hospitality one is like the more challenging one. It's just like, how are we going to get people to these spaces?
Yeah.
And what is the market size for that?
Absolutely.
It's like 10 people that maybe would do that. Be like, I'm going to go somewhere and I'm going to go get high and like enjoy my time with a bunch of other people. I mean, even when I went to bars, when I went to bars, I would go to bars with my wife. We'd have a couple drinks. We'd talk to each other. Not like I'm like socializing with a bunch of people. We'd have our food, drink a couple drinks, and we'd be on with our day, right? So there's definitely a case for it. I just don't know how big that market is. And that's the thing that I think it has to be proven out, is like, how big is the market for the hospitality license?
Right. And I hope we don't see the repeat of the green rush where people will swing open their doors and just expect people to come no matter what. I think with social consumption, it's going to be key that you can either have almost a sustainable business without the cannabis aspect of it. So it needs to be something like a candlepin bowling alley, or something that draws people there and they want to be there regardless of the cannabis, and the cannabis is just kind of an added bonus.
Yeah.
I think that's a model that when we look at the rare places around the world where these places exist, that it's typically something like that, and that you can't just swing open your doors and have a few couches there and be like, yeah, you can come smoke a joint here and hang out and expect people to come in.
Well, this is a well-trodden path for anybody who's ever opened a restaurant.
Right.
They are they close every day. They're not something that's sustainable for long periods of time. And so if you're trying to make it on those types of margins, which are super razor thin, like you have to have an alternative, a supplemental kind of way of providing that. Now, but the hospitality one I think is definitely the trickier one. And I don't know if there's going to be that one mega store or lounge where everybody goes to. Like Summit Lounges was kind of like the spot for the longest time. Now there's a couple of smaller ones popped up, but like, I just don't know. I mean, there's brand activation opportunities for us, I guess, to go to those spots and like have a booth or whatever. But again, if it's a private club, like what's going to happen to the private clubs when all those regulations get finalized? There's going to be enforcement against Summit Lounge. I don't know. These are all open questions, and maybe people have already figured this out. I don't know. But I do know that there's a lot of questions in my head of how to make something like a Summit Lounge successful, for more than just like, because every time I go to the Summit Lounge, it's just like
it's just 3 nights.
It's always industry night.
Cannabis. How do you break out of that cannabis bubble and make it something that's into the mainstream? Which I think is probably the hardest thing to figure out.
And then on top of that, have to adhere to all those regulations. All the air handling, like all that extra stuff, tips training, like everything else on top of everything that you already have to do makes it 10 times harder. So yes, there are going to be people who are going to be like, it's the green rush, I can't wait to have my restaurant. And then you open the doors and one person shows up and they're like, kind of awkward being the only person at a restaurant. I'm going to go.
Right. And I think that all those costs add up too. And if we get to the point where you buy a pre-roll at the consumption lounge that you could have bought at the dispensary for $10, and at the consumption lounge, it, much like a beer at a restaurant, it's all of a sudden 2.5 times more than it would have
$25 for a pre-roll.
Exactly.
Oh, it's hard.
Yeah. So
it'd be like a special occasion thing at that point.
Know? Yep. And can you sustain off of that? So
Yep.
All
right, fantastic. Any shout outs that you want to give to kind of like what you're representing right now? So if you have like any, shout out to Worcester Business Journal or whatever else that's going on that you want to give a shout out to, go for it.
Yeah, absolutely. So definitely Worcester Business Journal. Our subscription price is actually going to raise a bit at the end of the year. So if this goes out before the end of the year and you have time to grab a subscription, please do that. They're a locally owned publication. It's been really super helpful to my career to be able to have a platform that they've given me like this. So definitely check out Worcester Business Journal. I think if you're in the cannabis space, we definitely write about cannabis a lot, but even if you're not, it'll help keep you informed about what's going on in central Massachusetts. So definitely check us out.
Yeah, for all the people like myself who see that dialogue and it says like, hey, you're out of articles, free articles, and I'm just like, I can't, what do I do now? Yeah. This is your chance.
Right. And I'm a consumer of news too. I hit that on other platforms all the time. I'm like, this is not reading this article. Like,
I guess I'm not reading this article.
but for Worcester Business Journal, know it's supporting me and a lot of other local people. We're locally owned, and that's very rare in media. So if you want publications like Worcester Business Journal to stay around, you got to support us. So please do.
Appreciate that. Appreciate your thoughts. Thank you so much, Eric, for coming on.
Thanks, Jason. I really appreciate being here. Thanks for having me.
Cheers. We'll see you next time then, guys. Cheers. Bye.